I'll record this just in case someone needs it. Um, Apparently at 11 o'clock, the government's going to come to check on me, I think.
What?
So if I hear a knock at the door and you see me leave, just kind of wait. It shouldn't take that long. They just check my temperature, then they leave. But they tend to come every day. So I don't think they trust me. I don't know what it is.
You're American, you
I haven't even been to America. I've been in Macau for like
know.
but whatever. So yeah, I don't know. That should happen at some point. If it does, just kind of stay on for a second. Hopefully can just run and do it and come back. So yeah. So I sent you a pretty detailed email about mocks.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure that you've read it because there's a lot of stuff in there that you need. But the basic thought behind it is that we're going to have mocks for Econ on Thursday. It's going to be a pretty busy day. 2 different papers, one in the morning and one in the afternoon, and then an extra one for Jessica. We'll start at about 8:40 ish. And the first paper is about an hour. First paper is an hour and a half, and then we'll do the second paper after lunch.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Henry.
Oh, nobody can hear me when I was in Chinese class. I was like shouting so loud. Everyone's like, "Oh no, Henry went to sleep."
Maybe you're on mute or something.
Oh my god.
But yeah, so paper 1 in the morning, paper 2 in the afternoon. Pretty much what I'll do is we'll get on here. I'll give you the paper in the chat. I'll just drop it there for you, and then you can download it and start. You'll need to kind of time yourself because I'll be here, but then I'll probably go away for a little bit, and you just need to work on it on your own. And then I'll come back right towards the end. The thing is, as well, is that you're going to need to kind of like, I'll set a time for you to log back into Zoom because obviously like I can't just turn on your Zoom. You have to log in. So I'll give you some time and you'll have to kind of keep track of that so that we can log into Zoom and finish up. So it's a little bit of you doing it on your own kind of thing. The biggest thing for me is like just making sure that you do it yourself. Yeah, like there's no point in wasting our time by using your notes to do this. Like the purpose of this is for you to practice doing it and for me to see where you're at. And if you do it with your book and notes, then I think you're in good shape. And then you're not because you just cheated. So like I can't really use this as a grade, so there's no real point in cheating on it anyways. So give me a real understanding of where you're at. So take it realistically. And obviously do the best you can on it under these circumstances. So that's all I ask for you guys. Just give it your best shot and do it yourself. There's not much I can do. I'm not going to sit on Zoom for an hour and a half while you take it. I'll start the exam, and none of your teachers are. I'll start the exam, and then I'll come back in the middle probably, and then come back at the end just to make sure that you're okay with it. So in general, are there any questions about the exam?
No.
So it's just like online, and then we have to like write it down.
Yeah. So pretty much, yeah. I'll share it with you guys right before the exam. You'll download it. You'll take it on paper because that's a big part of the exam is obviously making sure you can write it. And then you will scan it back to me.
Okay.
What
scan app do you use?
I sent it in the email that I sent you guys. It's called Genius.
Scan.
I don't know if is it on Android?
It's on the Play Store.
It's on the
Google Play Store.
Okay, perfect. So if you have another one, I don't really care what you use. I just use Genius Scan and it works for me. So yeah, just I guess just check it. Jessica tried it out. You can try it out, make sure it works for you. And then you can send it back to me however you want. I like Genius Scan because it puts it all in one document. Instead of you sending me like 8 pictures, it puts it into one compressed document. It makes it easier, but it's up to you. I don't really care. Okay. So the thought process is that we can go through and talk a little bit about your papers just to make sure that you guys are okay with the papers. So I'm going to share this with you. I'll be right back. Hold on. Let's let me grab some. Oh, sorry, 1 second. Okay. So you can kind of see on the screen paper 1. I think obviously we're all familiar with these, but I just kind of want to give you like one last look at them to make sure that you are comfortable with everything. So paper 1, you've got 4 questions, as you know. Each question is broken down into A and B. You're going to choose 1 question from micro, 1 question from macro. Make sure that you use that reading time, which I will be there for the entire reading time. Make sure that you figure out what you want to answer and how you want to answer it. You can't mark during the reading time. You can't pick up your pencil, but you can think about what you want to do in that time and which questions you want to answer. Obviously, normally you would have a translation dictionary available. I obviously can't give you one. If you have a paper translation dictionary and you would like to use it, you're free to use it. I would say I don't want you using a computer to do that. So if you don't have one, I'm sorry, it's just kind of the way it goes. But if you do have a paper translation dictionary and you would like to use it, that's perfectly fine. So yeah, just prepare one if you can, or maybe go out and get one if you can, if you don't have it, and you feel like you would need it. If you don't use it in your exams, don't worry about it, because some of you don't use it, and that's fine. You don't have to have it. So that's basics of paper 1. Just to kind of break down, making sure that how you're answering it. Make sure, because you're doing it all on your own paper, make sure that you are clearly labeling what you're answering so that I know what you're answering. So you can label like question 1A and then start, and then 1B and go. Like, just make sure that it's really clear to me, so I don't have to go back and answer and ask you kind of like what's going on and things like that. A, as you know, tends to be just a really basic knowledge question. You only need to, the big things you need to do are you need to define, you need to explain, you need to give an example, a real life example, and you need to diagram. Usually those 4 things, and doing that will get you closer to full marks. make sure you don't go crazy, because sometimes people write way too much on paper and part A and they're wasting their time. So try not to overdo it. What you could do is leave yourself space. So like, let's say you've written a page and a little bit, you could leave the rest of that page blank and then move on to B. And then if you have extra time later, you could come back and keep writing on A. But you don't want to get too overboard with A because there's only so many marks that you can get. And usually those marks are pretty easy for me to give. You either have done it or you haven't done it. So there's no need to like go crazy with A. A one-page answer for A tends to be pretty good. 1 to 2 pages is definitely enough. There's no need to really go like above and beyond that. B, B can sometimes link to A and sometimes not link to A. It just depends on the test. Sometimes A and B are very different, and then sometimes A and B is very the same. If A and B are very similar, you can reference things that you wrote in A. I would be careful doing that too much because you're not really supposed to get double points, but you don't want to waste your time defining things that you've already defined in the first part of the answer. So just be careful of, you can reference in B, reference A, that's fine, but don't get too comfortable referencing everything in A if they're connected, because usually the second part of the question wants you to talk about something different than A. So if you're referencing A the entire time, then you're doing something wrong most likely.
What about some key terms?
Key terms are okay. Key terms are okay. So if both of them are talking about negative externalities, then it's easy for you to define it in A, then reference it in B, and that's okay.
What about graphs?
That's where it becomes a little bit trickier. I would be careful for with graphs. I think definitions are okay, but diagrams, most likely you want to draw it in B. I think it's just a better option.
Okay.
But what happens if they say, let's say A question was about subsidy and B question was about like what would be a solution to provide more merit goods, then it can be subsidy, then it's gonna be exactly the same graph, but do I have to draw it again?
So in that type of situation, what I would do is say that, like, if it gives you subsidy in A, then I would reference subsidy, but then I would also reference like potential other solutions.
Yeah, of course, yeah. But like I don't see a point of drawing subsidy graph in A and drawing subsidy graph again in B.
Yeah, I see your point. I think you just need to. Normally, the IB won't give you marks for the same thing twice. So you kind of have to be careful about that, because you don't want to think that your graph in A, which gets you points in A, can also get you points in B, because it normally doesn't. So just, be careful with that. If it's the exact same thing, then I guess you could get away with it. But again, the IB, I don't really see many questions that do that type of thing. So B, obviously you need to do the same things that you've done in A, but if you only do the same things that you've done in A, you're only going to be getting about 7 or 8 points. If you really want to get above that level, then you need to look at that evaluation section. So things like making sure you have pros and cons in there, which we haven't done this in a while, so which is why I want to cover some of it. Things like pros and cons, long-term impact versus short-term impact. And then like stakeholders. So who's going to be involved in that decision? Usually it's the 3 main stakeholders, which are consumers, producers, and the government. But depending on the situation, it might be more specific than that. but you do need to talk about how different people are going to be impacted. That could be like, if you're talking about unemployment, how is it going to impact younger people versus older people? If you're talking about inequality, you could talk about how is it going to impact poor people versus richer people. There's lots of different things in terms of stakeholders that you could potentially reference.
Mr. Peebles?
Yeah.
So in part B, let's say the question is about effect of tax.
Yeah.
And then I talked about pros and cons, long-term and skateboarder and those things. And when I evaluate about this, do I have to draw a graph for the another solution like subsidy?
Well, it depends on exactly the question, but if you feel like you need to offer another solution or an alternative to it,
Yeah.
then
is it better to draw another graph for okay.
For
And
the
analyze the graph too?
Yes. Yeah, follow the same stuff that you would do in an IA.
So normally part B, we have to draw like two graphs. The question that is asking us to draw and another solution, right?
Yeah, so again, it just depends on the question, but normally, yes, you're going to be drawing a graph for what's happening initially, and then you could draw a graph again for what might happen if something changes. It's hard to say that for sure because obviously every question is so different, but I would say if you think that you should be drawing a graph, you probably should draw that graph. And then obviously a graph that's drawn is pointless unless you've explained it. So don't like randomly throw in graphs because you're just wasting your time. Make sure that you've fully explained them. Opportunity cost, if it fits, make sure you include it. Opportunity cost doesn't always fit, but if it does fit, put it in there. And then make sure that you sum up at the end. I think it's one of the big things that you can do to help yourself is to put in that conclusion. Like, make sure that you've, in that last two sentences, that you've clearly answered the question. Because you can't get above 7 points if you don't clearly answer the question. So that summary at the end is a really good way to show the grader that you can clearly answer the question. So yeah, make sure that you do it. Especially, like, I think in the second question, you tend to be running out of time. So I think once you get to that 5-minute mark where you're getting close to finishing, you need to start thinking about, like, where am I? And sorry, I'm getting text messages about the government coming to visit me. Super exciting. I don't know, maybe Star feels it. Like, it's kind of like, you know you're not sick, but it's like really nervous. Like,
when
people, they come and they knock and there's like 18 of them. And
18
Do
of
they
them?
wear like
they don't wear like, at least here, they haven't worn like suits or anything, but like there's a lot more than there need to be of people. And none of them
they all speak Chinese and you don't understand what they're saying.
runs away.
Yeah, and they're just like, they like to take pictures of me. They're like, when they're checking my temperature, like doing things, everyone's taking pictures. It's just very it's very nerve-wracking. Like, I'm not sick, but they make me feel like I'm sick because they're just like questioning me and looking at my passport, and it's not the funnest thing in the world. So yes. Okay, back to this. Okay, so that's paper one. Hopefully, we've done more paper one practice than anything else. So hopefully you are pretty comfortable with it. In the past, I've noticed paper one tends to be people's strong suit, which is good because it's 50 points. And it's a little, depending on, for SLs, it's like 45% of your total grade. So yeah, it's pretty important. Any paper one questions in general that I can answer?
Yeah, I have a question about real life example.
Yeah.
So can you write about real example with graphing things?
You could. It depends on the situation, but my thought
So what
is
do you mean by giving examples?
so like if you want to show that you can connect it to another topic. So in that analysis, for the analysis points that you get in part B, you need to be able to show that you understand that it could happen in this situation and that it can relate to another topic in this situation. I think this is easier to do in macro than it is in micro, because micro tends to be about individual firms and individual people. So it's a lot harder to use real life examples. In macro, those real life examples are really easy because it's about governments and policies and things like that, which is a lot easier to talk about. So I do feel like the real life examples in micro are a lot harder. But if you feel like you can connect it to another topic, you should try to do that because it'll show that you understand that this can happen in other places.
So when you label the graph, so let's say I put Apple iPhone market and market for like iPhone.
Mm-hmm.
And then I wrote the quantity and price. And I showed the prices increasing. It doesn't mean I'm showing the real life example.
Yes, if you're using that as your example, if you're talking about, I don't know, substitution effect, and then you decide to talk about Apple iPhones and Samsung Galaxy, then you're giving a real life example. So that would be what you need to do.
Okay. And same as in part A, right?
Yeah, similar in part A. Part A and part B should both be using examples and real life examples if possible.
Okay. Well, let's move on.
Okay, onward. Paper two. So again, this tends to be one of the harder questions, harder parts. I think maybe because we don't do as many or because it covers so much different stuff. Not really sure why it becomes like a more difficult thing for people, but it tends to be. It's 40 points, which for SL means that it's like 35% of your grade. So it's more than your it's worth more than your IA, but less than your paper one. You need to choose one question from A and one question from B. A tends to be on one set of topics, and then B tends to be on another set of topics. So usually, like, both A questions will be about exchange rates. So if you're not comfortable with exchange rates, there's no real way to get out of the question because they tend to be both the same, at least the same topic, but with just different articles. In your reading time, there's not going to be enough time for you to read the articles. But what you need to do is you need to look at the questions, but specifically part D, and make sure that you're comfortable with part D. Because part D is the biggest mark, and if you can't do part D, then you probably shouldn't do the question. What people tend to do is they tend to look at the definitions and say, oh, I don't know how to define that word, and then they skip it. But a definition is only 2 points. So if you can't define a word, try, obviously, but don't feel like you can't do the question. If you're comfortable with the graphs and you're comfortable with part D, then go ahead and do the question. And that should be what you're doing during the reading time, is figuring out what questions you want to answer, because you don't need to read the entire article if you don't. Hold on, guys. They're knocking at my door, so I'm going to have to go for a little bit. Wish me luck.
I'm going to arrest you.
Good luck.
Star, what about you?
Nothing is happening. They don't even come to my room.
No, that's good.
They just come in the morning and dinner.
They just give you breakfast and then lunch and then that's all.
Jessica.
How's the breakfast?
Hey, where's Jessica?
Jessica is here.
Is that paper 2? Which question need to drop the graph?
What? Which
Part C and D. Yeah.
Okay.
No, B, C, D.
Yeah, B, C, B, C.
You need to draw also. Probably we say use the ADAS graph to explain blah blah blah.
Yeah. That's why B, C, D, somewhere around there.
Yeah.
B, C, D, C, D, B, D.
Hey, Lucy，你知道我们的 math 老师什么都没教，我裂开了。
我非这个是了。
你知道我们 math 老师不知道在干什么？
就让我们写作业啊。
这不是他考试的东西一点都没复习，他到现在都没有跟我们联系过，你知道吗？我他妈裂开了，唉，GG 的。
加油加油！
哎呀，
我真的原地裂开。Lucy， 你那边的那怎么那么黑呀、那一边
，baby，
你那边怎么那么黑？你坐哪？你坐
这里。
你是不是待在家里要待2个星期，不能出去？
我可以出去，但是我不是很想出去。AP 啊，不对啊，
不会出去的。
没有啊，他们说从外面回来人都要在家里面待2个星期，不能出去。我们小区就这样。
我一回来到处去逛街去了。
我们这个时候还没事，现在应该要的。主要是中国现在没那么严重了。
现在国外严重了。
有人在叫你。
谁在叫我
？PUBG. Let's play tomorrow 8:40. Henry. Fuck. Peter.
Yes, Chris. Yeah. Can you hear me?
PUBG Mobile. We'll play tomorrow 8:40 a.m.
考呗，没关系啊，just get out，一抵啊。
Hey, Star. Star. Star.
Start close 的他的麦克。
Yes, sir, Christian.
Play PUBG
Chris.
tomorrow 8:40.
Play what?
PUBG tomorrow 8:40.
You give up?
Are you in, Peter?
No.
Is Mr. Peebles listening? Man, you know how easy it is to cheat on
No.
Just open your computer and then type on computer.
Remote
For your
exam
system
score.
to cheat.
I don't need the grade. I just need the final. So
Exactly.
there is no point of doing this, cheating this, marking this. It's just
So
a practice
useless, you
for.
know, wasting my time.
It's just practice for final. Yeah. Because it doesn't help. The grade doesn't do anything and doesn't help anything.
I'm alive.
Oh, you're back. Yes.
Oh.
What did they say?
These government officials literally look like children. Like they're all dressed like Henry. I don't know what's going on.
What?
Hurry, show your face.
They were all wearing like the same they looked like Henry. Like there were like 4 of them and they were all with masks and they looked exactly like Henry. I don't.
What?
So maybe you're a government official, Henry. I don't know. They look like they were all 18 years old. Okay. Back to it, I guess. Okay,
They're
yeah.
doing
So,
community service.
what's up? Someone was saying something?
They're doing community service.
Yeah, maybe it's Cass. Go measure the floor temperature.
Mr. Peebles,
Yeah.
what happened if we don't take a mock test? It doesn't even go to our report card, so.
No, but it's better to take.
Obviously, yeah. Obviously, it's better to take.
For example, you were sleeping until like 9 o'clock and the exam started at like 8:40 and you couldn't take then.
Well, if it's obviously it's up to. Normally, it would be up to Miss Martina who's running the session, but because we're doing it in this way, it's kind of up to each teacher. Like, if you're a couple minutes late for my exam, I'm not really too worried about it. But if you're like half an hour late, it would be difficult for you to take it at that point. Obviously, I would recommend you being on time for your exams, but if you are late, just try to communicate with the teacher and let them know what's going on. If you know you're going to miss something, like we will be flexible, but you just need to try to communicate with us. Like, obviously for me or like Star, it's sometimes difficult to determine what's going to happen because people show up and they want to talk to you and there's nothing you can do about it. But for most of you who aren't under quarantine, you should be able to know what's going to happen. So yeah, just try to be responsible and do what you can. Okay. Yep. Figure out what you want to answer by using D. How much time do we have left? 4 minutes. And then this is the breakdown of the exam. A is definition. B is the 2 diagrams. B and C are the 2 diagrams, usually 2 diagrams. With A, just make sure that you define an example. So that's all you need is 2 sentences. 2 sentences. C, or B and C are just diagrams. Usually 2 points for the diagram, 2 points for the explanation of the diagram. The explanation doesn't need to be crazy. Just explain why you chose the diagram if there was a choice, and explain why the shifting has happened, why you chose to shift. Make sure you fully label it, because if you don't label the diagram, you lose a point. And then D is that mini IA that will take you a while to do. Yeah, make sure that you're referencing the text, you're using the article given. And then pretty much just go through what you would do in an IA, diagram it, and then make sure you give a full evaluation. If it's asking you to use one thing, right? Like if it's saying, discuss the benefits of fiscal policy, well, then you need to also make sure that you're talking about monetary policy. If it's saying, talk about expansionary policies, then you need to also talk about contractionary policies. So just make sure that
part D, right?
Correct, yeah. Because one of the parts of part D is that you have a balanced argument, which means that you're showing both sides. So if you only talk about one thing, then you won't be able to get full marks. So make sure that you're.
And you have to also define them?
Correct, you need to define everything you use.
Okay.
And then remember, you want to use about 15 minutes in these three, and then about 30 minutes here. I know that's difficult sometimes, but that's kind of the way that you would want to break it down, if possible. Try to not leave any of these blank either. It's pretty easy to get a point or two if you just write some stuff. So write some stuff. Yeah, that's all I can think of. Okay. Questions on paper 2? That's paper 3. Any questions on paper 2?
I have a question in paper 2.
What's up?
You say in part A, you have to give an example?
Correct, if possible.
Oh, if possible?
Yeah.
So can you get 2 points without, 4 marks without examples?
It's possible, okay. Yes. I always tend to do the examples because it gives the grader an understanding that you know what the word means. So if your definition is a little bit wrong, but then you use the example correctly, then you're in better shape. So that's why I tend to use the example. Because it tends. It
doesn't have to be real life example, right?
No, just use an example of whatever it's asking about. So like if you're talking about infrastructure, then give me 2 different types of infrastructure.
Okay. That
type of stuff. Okay.
But you have to give the example when you define the word, right? Isn't it?
You, depending on how you define it, you might give an example in the definition, which is fine. But like if you're thinking about defining opportunity cost is the next best alternative given up based on the decision that you've made. And then you'd say, for example, this.
Okay.
So depending on how you define it, it depends on if you need an example.
Okay.